There are graves beneath the church floorboards. They never told you that, but someone made sure they'd never rest. Eastern Kentucky, 1834. Before roads were paved, before maps marked the hollows, a man and his daughters walked into a town that didn't want to be found. They came without warning, without invitation. By the time they left 3 days later, every secret Pine Hollow had buried for decades was bleeding in the open air. But this story doesn't begin with death. It begins with knowledge. Knowledge so unnatural it bypassed every rational law we hold sacred. Knowledge whispered through children's mouths, precise as blades. This was no parlor trick. No exaggeration passed down through the years. These are documented facts, painstakingly recorded by a man of God whose faith would be broken forever. You see, in a place like Pine Hollow, silence is a currency. The fewer questions you ask, the longer you live. But when 2 9-year-old twins named Rebecca and Rachel Morrison arrived with their father, Ezekiel, they asked nothing. Instead, they told. They told truths no outsider could have known, about hidden sins, buried letters, stained floorboards, and screams that echoed beneath the hymns. And the most terrifying part, every single thing they said turned out to be true. This isn't folklore. This isn't some internet campfire tale. You're about to descend into a real, documented historical case that psychologists, clergy, and skeptics alike have failed to explain for over 190 years. And I'm not here to entertain you. I'm here to break something in you, a belief, a certainty, a defense you've used to shield yourself from what's always been watching from the edge of reason. Because the Morrison twins didn't just predict future events, they unraveled lives, quietly, gently, like a whisper in a confession booth you never knew you'd entered. And what I revealed suggests something far older and far more organized than coincidence. By the end of this story, you'll have a choice to make. Go back to sleep, or stay wide awake in a world that's been lying to you since birth. The real question isn't how they knew, it's why they came, and what they left behind. They arrived on the 3rd day of November. Cold clung to the valley like something alive. The trees were half naked, rattling like bones in the wind, and the roads had turned to mud from an early rain. No one saw them coming, and no one had expected them. That's part of what made the whole thing so unsettling. You don't forget the moment strangers show up uninvited, especially not in Pine Hollow. Ezekiel Morrison was not a man who needed to speak to command a room. He was tall, lean, and travel-worn, his boots caked in Cumberland clay, his shoulders stooped from carrying burdens far heavier than his satchel. His daughters walked beside him, not behind, their hands clasped together like they shared the same breath. They didn't speak, they didn't smile, but their eyes were awake in a way children's eyes should never be. Pastor William Phillips recorded it all. That's how we know. His journals weren't meant for public eyes. They were private, scratched in a tight, deliberate hand, the script of a man trying to make sense of something that shattered his theology. The first time he saw the twins, he wrote this: "There is a shadow in their stillness, not evil, not quite, but it sees more than it should, as if the girls had already walked this ground in another time, and were now simply returning to finish what was left undone." Rebecca, the elder by minutes, had a lightness to her. People would later call it charm, but it wasn't charm, it was ease, as if she wasn't visiting this world, but reclaiming it. Rachel was the opposite, quiet, glacial, always a step behind, but somehow always watching you before you even looked her way. Pastor Phillips described her as the one who listens to things that aren't being said aloud. Their arrival would have gone unnoticed if not for that first dinner. It was Rebecca who broke the silence with a question that struck like a lightning bolt through Mrs. Phillips's spine. "Did the roses survive the blight?" she asked, unblinking. "The ones near the east fence from 3 summers ago?" No one outside of Pine Hollow could have known about those roses, but Rebecca did, and that was just the beginning. That night, Pastor Phillips didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the low ceiling beams of his cabin, hearing every creak, every whisper of wind, as if the world itself had become conscious. The child's question about the rose blight haunted him, not just because she knew something she shouldn't, but because she had said it so casually, as if it were nothing, as if everything was nothing to her. The next morning began with frost biting the corners of the window panes. Phillips rose before dawn, as was his ritual, but when he reached for his coat and stepped into the hearth room, he wasn't alone. Ezekiel was already there, Bible open on his lap, but unread. He wasn't studying. He was staring into the fire's remains, face drawn tight with concern, not fear, something worse. Recognition. They had dreams again, Ezekiel said softly. Dark ones. Before Phillips could ask what that meant, Rebecca appeared in the doorway. She looked like a child who had slept peacefully, except for her eyes. They were too clear, too focused, as if her dreams had opened a door that never quite closed. She pointed toward the chapel and said, "Under the third floorboard from the altar, there's something there, something you hid." Phillips felt ice in his chest. He hadn't told a soul. 3 months earlier, in a moment of weakness, he had hidden a bottle of whiskey under that exact board, wrapped in a blue baby blanket, a remnant of the child he had lost 5 years ago, the boy who had died before ever drawing breath. The bottle wasn't just temptation, it was a tombstone, a secret buried in shame. And now, 2 girls who had never stepped foot in this town were naming it out loud. Rachel stepped forward, her voice quieter than a breath. "You didn't bury it to drink it. You buried it so it could watch you try not to." Phillips dropped into the nearest chair, stunned. How could they know? How could anyone? And then the girls said something else, something worse. "This isn't the first church with secrets in its floor," Rachel whispered. "But it might be the first where the dead remember." It was no longer just knowledge, it was warning. That Sunday, the pews were full. Word travels fast in small places, especially when the unnatural walks among them. Pine Hollow's church had not seen such attendance in years. Even those who typically avoided worship came, not out of devotion, but out of a quiet, rising dread. There was something about the Morrison twins that demanded witness. Ezekiel's sermon was delivered with fire. He spoke of confession, of the sins that rot a soul from within, of judgment delayed but not denied. It was powerful, but not unfamiliar. Circuit preachers often thundered their way through sin and salvation. What made this service different began the moment it ended. As the congregation rose to leave, Rebecca stepped off the pew and walked directly to Samuel Turner, a wealthy man, a deacon, respected by all. She looked up with those disarming blue eyes and said plainly, "It's not stealing if you put it back, right, Mr. Turner? Papa says God forgives those who try." Turner's face turned the color of ash. No one else knew, but he did. For 6 months he had been skimming coins from the offering plate, small amounts barely noticeable. A temporary loan, he had told himself, just until the land sale came through. But it hadn't, and the guilt had festered like a wound he dared not touch. Before he could respond, Rachel stepped forward. She turned to Martha Whitfield, the aging widow who ruled Pine Hollow's moral code like a hawk. "Your husband didn't die in that farming accident, did he?" she asked, voice like a distant wind. "He's still alive. You keep his letters in the chest under your bed." The air drained from the room. Mrs. Whitfield's hands trembled. She had told no one, not even her children, that her husband had fled 15 years earlier, taking everything with him. His letters still arrived twice a year, filled with apologies and pleas for forgiveness. She had hidden them, buried the M in a box, wrapped in old linens. The truth was too costly. And now, it was exposed. One by one, the twins moved through the room, to the doctor who had never finished his training, to the family hiding a mentally ill son in their attic, to the boy sleeping with a married woman. They didn't accuse, they revealed, calm, absolute, as if reading from a book no one else could see. Secrets bled from their mouths like confessions from the dead. The congregation stood frozen. It wasn't just fear, it was the suffocating weight of exposure. In Pine Hollow, sins didn't stay buried. They festered behind polite smiles and Sunday suits. But the Morrison twins had peeled back every mask in the room with quiet precision, like surgeons revealing rot beneath healthy flesh. But it was what came next that would shatter the illusion of normalcy forever. Rebecca walked to the altar. Slowly, deliberately, her hand, pale and small, rested on the old wooden cross carved decades ago by the church's founding men. She didn't smile. She didn't blink. She just spoke. "This is sacred ground," she said softly. "But it's stained. The Whitman family didn't die in a house fire, did they, Pastor Phillips?" Gasps rippled through the room. They died right here, in this church, and some of you know exactly why. The silence was complete. Even the wind outside had stopped, as if the world itself was listening. Pastor Phillips didn't move. Couldn't move. He gripped the pulpit with white-knuckled hands, as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. The Whitman family. The name had not been spoken in over a decade. Official records, his own records, claimed they had perished in a fire in their home during a brutal winter storm. Father, mother, and twin daughters. Tragic. Accidental. The town had mourned, buried them, and never looked back. But Rebecca's words carried details no outsider could have known. Not from folklore, not from chance. Elder Thompson, a founding member of Pine Hollow and one of the few still living who had known the Whitmans personally, stood slowly. His legs shook beneath him, his voice cracked like dry timber. "Child," he said, "you speak of things that happened before your birth, in places you've never seen. How could you possibly—" Rebecca turned to him, calm. Her eyes met his like an old soul speaking to a gill. "Time man." Faith had a birthmark on her shoulder, she said. Hope wore a locket with her mother's hair. When they died, one was in her Sunday dress, the other in a nightgown because she was sick. Thompson sat down like a man struck by lightning. She was right. Every detail, every impossible truth. The church hadn't buried a tragedy. It had buried a crime. The church felt colder than before, not from the wind outside, but from something older, something long sealed, now awakened. It was Rachel who spoke next, her voice quieter than her sister's, but somehow heavier. "They came here that night," she said. "The Whitman girls, their parents. They were afraid. They weren't running from fire. They were running from people." A low murmur rippled through the pews. Pastor Phillips gripped the edge of the pulpit as if his knees might give out. He had heard whispers over the years, fragments of rumors spoken only behind closed doors, but nothing solid, nothing he dared believe. Rachel continued, her words slow and deliberate. "They hid in the church, behind the altar, but they were found. No one moved, no one breathed." It was as if the entire congregation had slipped into a collective hallucination, except this wasn't madness. It was memory clawing its way back into the open. Mrs. Whitfield's hand trembled against the pew. Her lips parted, but no sound came. Her eyes stared forward, vacant with recognition. She had been there. She had known. Not everything, but enough. Rebecca looked around the room as if scanning for lies that hadn't yet risen. "You prayed over their graves," she said, "but they're not buried where you think they are." Pastor Phillips felt it before he thought it. The floor, the foundation. When they had repaired the eastern wall of the chapel 3 years earlier, the workers had uncovered fragments, splintered bone, hair twisted through mortar, nails bent at wrong angles. They told themselves it was animal remains, settler debris, anything but human. He remembered the unease he'd felt then, the way the air had thickened, the dreams that followed. "The church was built on top of it," Rachel whispered. "You held services over their bodies." And now the implications bloomed like rot. Every sermon, every baptism, every moment of worship had been a ritual atop a grave, an unspoken sacrament of collective guilt. That's when the wind returned, fast and sudden. It slammed the chapel door open with a sharp crack, startling several of the congregants. Rachel turned her head toward the sound but didn't flinch. "They're listening now," she said. In that moment, no one doubted her. They had uncovered something, and it was not done speaking. The chapel door creaked slowly in the wind, groaning like a warning, but no one moved to close it. They were paralyzed, not with fear, but with recognition, the kind that arrives not like lightning, but like rising water. You don't feel it until your feet are already wet. Rebecca and Rachel stood together in front of the altar. They didn't look triumphant. They looked tired, like children who had seen too much and carried too many truths too early. Pastor Phillips couldn't take his eyes off them. It was as if they weren't just speaking memories, they were releasing them, loosing them from wherever they'd been trapped, under floorboards and behind old bones. Elder Thompson cleared his throat, not to speak, but to break the spell. It didn't work. Mrs. Carter, who had said nothing since the revelations began, leaned forward and whispered to the women beside her. Her voice was low, but the words carried, "I remember the stains." Everyone turned. She continued slowly. "Years ago, when I was a girl, blood rose through the cracks in the floor near the altar. We scrubbed, we prayed, but it kept coming back. Just faint enough to explain away, just stubborn enough to haunt." No one laughed. No one doubted her. Then Benjamin Foster, nearly blind, mostly deaf, spoke up from the back pew. "Children cry at night," he said. "When the wind gets quiet. I've heard them, thought it was the trees, but it wasn't." Phillips swallowed hard. Every thread was converging now, every denial collapsing like wet timber. He remembered something too, a night 6 years earlier when he'd found a small wooden doll behind the altar, carved from oak. No one claimed it. He assumed a child had left it behind, but when he picked it up, it was damp and cold, as if it had just been held. Ezekiel finally spoke, his voice like distant thunder. "They don't do this for attention," he said. "They don't seek glory. They reveal what festers because it must be revealed, and they're never wrong." He looked at Phillips directly. "They don't remember these things, they relive them." The wind pushed harder against the chapel walls, and somewhere deep beneath the floor, something shifted, something old, something listening. It was Pastor Phillips who finally said it aloud. "Why now?" His voice cracked, hollow. "Why after all these years?" Ezekiel Morrison didn't answer right away. He looked at his daughters, not as a father, but as a man who'd lived too long with a truth he couldn't explain. Rebecca met his gaze with a strange gentleness, the kind that doesn't belong to children. Rachel, always a step behind in speech, spoke first this time. "Because the ground is waking up." A shiver swept the room, not from cold, but from the certainty in her voice, not prophecy, not theory. Statement. Then Rebecca added, "It never really slept, just waited for someone to listen." There was no more sermon that day, no closing hymn, no communion, only questions. Some of the congregation tried to leave, but most stayed, as if fleeing would be an admission of guilt or cowardice. They needed to see this through, whatever this was. Mrs. Whitfield stood again. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with age and something far more dangerous, remorse. "We never meant to lie," she said. "We meant to survive." Elder Thompson covered his face with one shaking hand. For the first time in his life, Pine Hollow's most respected elder wept in public. "They came to the church that night," he whispered. "I remember. I was there." The silence in the chapel thickened. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "The storm had taken their house," he continued. "But they weren't running from the weather, they were running from him." "Who?" someone asked, though the answer was already circling the room like smoke. Rebecca turned toward the back pews. "The man who wore the cloth but drank from the hidden bottle." Pastor Phillips froze. It couldn't be. The timeline didn't match. He hadn't been the pastor then, but as he scanned the room, a thought struck him cold. The journals, the ones kept by the previous pastor, Jonathan Creel. He had disappeared, vanished one winter without explanation. They'd told themselves it was illness, or madness. But what if he hadn't left? What if someone had made him disappear to preserve the story? Rebecca looked at Phillips again, gently. "You'll find the truth in the ashes," she said, "but you'll lose yourself on the way." And for the first time, Phillips believed her. Because something had just changed in the chapel, not in the air, in the walls. By the time the last parishioner staggered out into the grey afternoon light, Pine Hollow was no longer the same town. Something invisible had cracked. It wasn't just the past bleeding through, it was the structure of the town itself, the trust, the order, the belief that secrets could stay buried if you just prayed hard enough and looked the other way. Pastor Phillips remained in the chapel, alone, or at least he thought he was alone. Rebecca and Rachel were still seated in the front pew, silent, hands folded like porcelain dolls at rest. Ezekiel stood behind them, unmoving, watching. "Do they know what they're doing?" Phillips asked. "Or are they just vessels?" Ezekiel didn't blink. "They know." That answer didn't bring comfort, The wind had died, but inside the chapel the air had grown heavier, charged, as if a storm was crouching just behind the rafters. Phillips sat beside them slowly, rubbing his temple like a man on the edge of fevered revelation. "What happened to Pastor Creel?" he finally asked. Rachel didn't look at him. She stared at the altar. "He saw what you're about to see." That night, Pastor Phillips stayed late. After the town went dark, he returned to the church alone, lantern in hand. It was foolish, he knew, but he had to know if it was madness or memory. He pried up the third floorboard. The whiskey bottle was still there, still wrapped in the blue blanket. But beneath it, something else. A folded paper, yellowed, brittle, ink faded almost to nothing. It was a letter, addressed not to a name, but to a title. "Whoever stands at this altar after me." Phillips sat down on the floor as he read. The letter was brief, but every word felt like a nail in his ribs. Creel had written it, during his final days. A confession, not of sin, but of knowledge. "The children speak the truth. I didn't kill them, but I let it happen. I let him do what? That he came to do because I believed his lies about protection, about necessity. He said their deaths would seal the town against the curse, but curses don't work that way. They grow roots." Phillips looked up from the letter. The altar loomed above him. The floor felt warm beneath his knees. And then he heard it. A faint knock. From underneath, the sound came again. Knock, pause. Knock, knock. It wasn't imagined. Pastor Phillips had heard plenty of creaks in that old church. He could tell the difference between wood settling and something alive. This wasn't the past returning as memory. This was the present reacting to exposure. Something had been unearthed too much, too fast, and now the floor itself was beginning to remember. He stood, slowly, the letter still trembling in his hand. The lantern cast shadows that twisted across the chapel walls, bending around the pulpit like old bones turning in their graves. The floor beneath the altar, the same place where the Morrison twins had spoken with such calm certainty, now felt warped, not visibly but spiritually, as if the boards covered not wood and stone but something hollow and ancient and listening. Phillips knew he should leave, but he couldn't. He had to know. He returned to the parsonage at dawn, eyes bloodshot, hands shaking. The letter never left his coat pocket, but sleep didn't come. Not for him, not for the town, because the twins had begun to speak again. That Monday, they stood outside the schoolhouse where they were supposed to receive a day's instruction from Miss Townsend, the town's only teacher. But instead of entering, they waited for the students to arrive, and one by one, as the children filed past, they whispered something to each. Nothing loud, nothing dramatic. Just words. But they were the right words. By noon, half the children had gone home early, sick or shaking or simply unwilling to speak. By sunset, Miss Townsend packed her belongings and left Pine Hollow. No explanation, just vanished. When asked what happened, Rebecca simply said, "We reminded them of who they used to be." Rachel added, "Some of them didn't like it." Phillips understood what that meant more than he wanted to. The twins didn't just reveal their sins of the living. They revealed identities, the buried layers beneath masks, the truths people worked their whole lives to forget. Ezekiel met with Phillips that evening, not as a preacher, but as a warning. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. "It's not about what happened to the Whitmans. It's about what the town became after they died. That's the story the ground keeps trying to tell." Then he added something else, something that turned Phillips's blood to ice. "And the girls, they're not done yet." By the third day, the town no longer looked the same. People kept their windows shuttered even in daylight. Conversations died when strangers approached. Children were kept inside. And yet the Morrison twins moved through Pine Hollow like phantoms, unbothered. Their presence wasn't loud. It was inevitable, like decay. But something had changed between them. For the first time, Rebecca and Rachel didn't walk hand in hand. Rebecca moved ahead now, speaking more, smiling faintly. She would greet townsfolk by name, even if she'd never been introduced. She would ask about their mothers, their fathers, about people who had died before she was born. Rachel, meanwhile, began to fade, not physically but emotionally. She stopped responding to questions. She stopped eating. She spent hours staring at trees, chimneys, grave markers, as if watching a scene no one else could see. Pastor Phillips noticed the change, and it terrified him. He invited the family to dinner again that evening. He needed to observe. He needed to understand. Rebecca spoke cheerfully over stew. She told Phillips's wife, "Your sister is safe. She forgives you for not being there." The woman dropped her spoon. Her sister had died a year earlier in childbirth. Phillips's wife hadn't made it to the funeral. She had never spoken of that guilt. Rebecca smiled as if offering absolution, but her eyes didn't match her tone. They were cold, focused, like someone performing a role. Rachel said nothing the entire meal. Afterward, Phillips asked Ezekiel about her condition. The man looked tired, more tired than he had the day he arrived. His voice was flat. "It happens," he said, "when they're near a place like this." Rachel withdraws. "It's not sadness, it's memory." Phillips leaned in. "Whose memory?" Ezekiel didn't answer. That night, Phillips dreamed of fire. Not metaphor, fire. And within the flames, two sets of twins, one living, one lost, standing across from each other like reflections misaligned. And behind them the church, its foundation cracked, its altar bleeding from beneath. He woke, gasping for air. The blanket was soaked in sweat, and from the parsonage window he saw Rachel. Alone, standing barefoot in the frost-covered yard, staring at the church, whispering something he couldn't hear. Something meant only for the ground. The next morning something strange happened. No one opened the church. Pastor Phillips had always been the first to arrive, unlocking the heavy oak doors before the sun climbed past the trees. But that day he stayed in bed, not out of laziness, but dread. The dream still clung to him like smoke in the lungs, the image of Rachel in the frost, the whisper he couldn't hear but somehow still felt. And beneath it all, that quiet knock from under the altar, pulsing like a heartbeat sealed beneath the floor. He wasn't the only one. Townsfolk who had never missed a Sunday began making excuses. Sick children, frozen pipes, the weather. But the sky was clear, the air calm. What kept them away wasn't illness. It was memory. Mrs. Whitfield locked herself in her bedroom and refused to speak. Elder Thompson took to wandering the cemetery, muttering the names of people long dead. Samuel Turner reportedly spent the entire day on his knees in the fields behind his house, digging holes for no purpose anyone could discern. Pine Hollow was unraveling, and still the twins remained. That afternoon, Rebecca knocked on the door of the town's oldest home, the abandoned Whitman house. No one lived there, no one dared to, not since the fire. But Rebecca didn't hesitate. She turned the knob and walked inside, Rachel following a few steps behind. A local boy saw them go in. When he crept up to the window to peek, he swore he saw candlelight flickering inside. But no one in Pine Hollow had stepped foot in that house for 16 years. Pastor Phillips heard about it an hour later. He rushed to the home, breathless, fists clenched with equal parts fear and responsibility. He found the door cracked open, the air inside stale and sharp with mildew. He stepped through the threshold and stopped cold. The living room had been cleared. Furniture gone. Walls stripped. At the center of the floor, two small chairs. Rebecca and Rachel sat facing each other, unmoving. On the walls around them, drawn in what looked like charcoal or ash, were names. Dozens of them, some crossed out, others circled. Phillips knew those names. Every single one had lived and died in Pine Hollow. Some recently, some long before even he was born. And as he backed away in horror, Rachel finally looked up and whispered, "They want to be remembered properly." The names on the wall haunted him. Pastor Phillips stood frozen, mouth dry, heart pounding as he scanned the room. The handwriting wasn't childish, it was sharp, meticulous, etched with the certainty of someone recording, not inventing. Some names he recognized immediately, townsfolk buried within the last decade. Others were older, much older, generations back, people who were never mentioned anymore. But what disturbed him most were the names crossed out. He stepped closer. One name had been circled 3 times, Hope Whitman. Beneath it, in smaller letters, was a date, December the 3rd, 1818. He traced the pattern with his eyes, how each circled name corresponded to a date and how many of the crossed-out ones didn't. Why some, and not others? Rachel remained seated, silent as glass, her eyes locked on the opposite wall. Rebecca watched Phillips closely now, not smiling, not accusing, just watching. "Do you know what a list is for, Pastor?" she asked softly. He turned toward her, not trusting his voice. "It's not to remember," she said. "It's to decide." That night, Phillips returned to the church and pulled out the town records, births, deaths, baptisms, marriages. The names matched, down to the spelling. He found individuals he hadn't thought of in years, people long dead, people whose passings had been labeled as accidental, natural, tragic. But something was wrong. The dates on Rebecca's wall were different than the official records, too different. In many cases, she listed the day before the official cause of death, as if she were recording the actual event, not the public version, as if the truth had always been a day early, or a lie late. Phillips barely slept. He scoured everything, old journals, forgotten correspondence, even the building permits from the church's original construction. And then, buried in a faded envelope sealed in wax, he found a single line of parchment. The children weren't killed in the fire. The fire was lit to hide what had already been done. No signature, no name, just those words. His hands trembled as he lowered the paper. Everything he thought he knew about Pine Hollow, about the values, the faith, the sacred history, was wrong. The fire wasn't a tragedy. It was a cover. And the twins weren't revealing secrets. They were executing memory. One name at a time. The next morning the air was different. Not colder, not heavier, but charged, like the sky before lightning. Pine Hollow's people began behaving strangely, not like men and women overtaken by madness, but like sinners on the edge of breaking. Confessions began to slip out. Not in the chapel, but in the streets, in kitchens, at wells and fence posts. Words fell from their mouths, unbidden, half-muttered admissions, secrets no one had asked for, memories no one had prompted. Mrs. Carter was the first. She wandered into the market square with her shoes on the wrong feet, clutching a letter no one had seen before. She thrust it into Pastor Phillips' hands, her eyes wide and wet. "He didn't abandon us," she whispered. "He was driven out. They beat him bloody in the sanctuary, said he'd brought sickness with his daughter's fits." The letter was stained with something dark, not ink. It was signed by her husband. Dated 1819. Next came Thomas Brett. He climbed to the church roof at noon and shouted into the empty woods, "I didn't know she was with child. I swear it. They told me she'd gone north." Then he jumped. Survived the fall, shattered his legs. Now he lies in a bed, screaming at shadows. None of it made sense. Until it did. Because Rebecca and Rachel were seen walking just past each of these outbursts, not watching, not whispering, just passing through, like wind that stirred a storm someone else had to endure. Pastor Phillips confronted Ezekiel again that evening, more desperate than before. "What's happening to them?" he asked. "To all of us?" Ezekiel looked more like a shadow than a man now, his beard untrimmed, eyes sunken. He hadn't slept either. "They're not causing anything," he said. "They're removing something. The silence. The sickness that's been here longer than this church. This town is waking up, and waking up hurts." Rachel appeared in the doorway. Her eyes didn't focus on either man. She spoke in a near whisper. "The ones who remember want to speak. The ones who stayed buried are angry." And then she turned her gaze toward the chapel. "You've walked over their names too long. Now they're rising." That night, Phillips returned to the altar. The knock came again. Only this time, it wasn't from below. It was from behind. The knock behind him wasn't loud. It was deliberate, measured. As if whoever or whatever stood behind the altar had waited long enough. Pastor Phillips froze. He turned slowly, expecting shadows, wind, maybe another dream. But what he saw made his breath catch. There, just behind the pulpit, where a wooden cross used to hang, the wall had cracked. A thin line had split down the center of the wood, revealing something darker beneath. Not rot, not water damage, something that looked like writing. He stepped closer, the lantern trembling in his grip. The crack widened, and from it, a voice. But not spoken, not in air. In mind. It was a name. Hope. He staggered backward. The name echoed, not in his ears, but in the bones of his skull, like memory becoming voice, like guilt demanding a throat. Hope. The same name Rebecca had circled. The girl the town had claimed died in the fire. Only now Phillips was beginning to understand. Hope Whitman had not been consumed by flame. She had been silenced before it, and the fire had swallowed only her grave. The door of the chapel creaked open. Rachel stood there, alone, still barefoot, still pale, her lips blue with cold. She walked to the altar and placed her hand on the crack in the wall. The light from Phillips's lantern dimmed as she whispered, "She's not alone anymore." The church groaned. Not from wind, from memory. The floorboards beneath them shifted, not downward, but upward, as if something beneath was pushing, like roots of a tree fighting for the surface. Then Rebecca entered. She held a book in her arms, leather-bound, old, too old. She placed it on the altar, beside Rachel. Phillips approached, barely breathing. He looked down. Every page in that book contained a name. Names no longer on the town's records. Names lost to fire, disease, natural causes. Names the town had allowed to vanish. At the end of the book, one page remained blank. Rebecca handed him a quill. "Write," she said. "Remember them, all of them." He stared. "And if I don't?" Rachel's voice was barely a whisper. "Then the ground will do it for you." The next morning, the graves began to open. It started quietly. No loud cracks of earth, no trumpet blast of resurrection. Just a subtle shifting of ground, like breath beneath blankets. But when the townsfolk came to tend the cemetery, they found the dirt disturbed. Not dug up, not vandalized. Loosened. Dozens of graves, old ones, unmarked ones. The headstones still stood, but the earth around them had buckled upward, as if what lay beneath had changed shape, or moved. And then came the stench, not of death, but of something older, mold, damp ash, the memory of fire. It drifted from the graves toward town, like a slow-moving fog. Philip stood at the edge of the churchyard, watching. The leather-bound book still lay open in his hands. He had not written a single name. He couldn't. Each one felt like an accusation. He turned to Ezekiel, whose face looked pale as candle wax. "You brought this," Phillips muttered. "You and your daughters." But Ezekiel shook his head. "They brought me." That night, a low hum began beneath the town. No one could explain it. It wasn't wind, it wasn't machinery. It was deeper, fainter, like 1,000 voices humming the same note underground. And still, the twins said nothing more. They only watched. At the Whitman house, where the names still covered the walls, neighbors gathered outside, drawn there, one by one. They didn't speak, they didn't blink. They simply looked through the windows at the names, as if trying to remember who they had once been. Phillips returned to the chapel alone that evening. The cracked wall behind the pulpit had spread, and something had emerged, barely visible, but there, a handprint, small, charred black. It hadn't been painted there. It had been burned into the wood from the inside out. He turned to leave and found Rachel standing in the doorway. Her mouth didn't move, but the voice entered his mind again, soft and precise. The fire wasn't the beginning. It was the silence before the scream. Phillips collapsed to his knees, the weight of it all pressing down like a cathedral roof. And then Rachel said, "One grave will open tomorrow. One name must be spoken aloud. If it isn't..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. because all around the church, the ground had begun to breathe. Morning came with frost, and with it, a gathering. The people of Pine Hollow stood outside the church, silent. No one had summoned them, yet all had come, as if the ground beneath their feet had pulled them there. Old men in stiff coats, young mothers clutching infants, children who did not cry. They stood in rows, faces pale, eyes wide. At the edge of the crowd, Ezekiel watched, unmoving. Rebecca and Rachel flanked him like sentinels. Their faces were still, but their presence radiated something electric, something ancient. Pastor Phillips emerged from the chapel, the leather-bound book in his hands. He had not slept. He hadn't dared, because sometime after midnight, one grave had opened, not torn apart, not dug up, just opened, neat, precise, as if it had been unzipped. The earth around it was blackened, not with soil, but with ash. And now the crowd waited. No one spoke. No one needed to. They felt it. The choice. Philip stepped forward and opened the book. The blank page stared back at him. A name had burned itself into the paper overnight. Hope Whitman. He looked up at the gathered town. She died in 1818, he said, voice trembling. But that was the lie. Hope wasn't a fire victim. She was a warning, a child who knew too much. She had fits, visions. She named things we couldn't bear to hear, and for that, she was silenced. The wind picked up. The pages of the book flipped backward on their own. The hum beneath the town deepened. Rachel stepped forward, her voice finally audible to all. Speak her name, not as a ghost, not as guilt, but as the first truth. Phillips dropped to his knees and whispered, Hope Whitman. The ground fell silent. The hum stopped. For a moment, and then screaming. Not human, earthen, as if the town itself had been holding its breath for 200 years and finally exhaled in agony. The blackened grave behind the chapel burst open, and from it rose smoke, thick, white, and shaped not like fire, but like a girl. A child's silhouette stood in the mist. No face, but in its hand, a page from the book. She turned and walked into the chapel. No footsteps, no sound, just memory in motion. Rebecca and Rachel watched her go, then turned to the town and said in unison, You will now speak all their names, or we will. They didn't move at first. The people of Pine Hollow stood frozen, as if the weight of one name had snapped something in their spines. Even those who hadn't known Hope Whitman, who hadn't been born when she burned, felt the guilt settle on them like ash. Pastor Phillips looked over the crowd, his breath clouding in the cold. Then someone stepped forward. It was Ruth Avery, the oldest living resident, 94, nearly blind. She leaned on her cane, lifted her face to the sky and whispered, Matthew Croft, 1807, throat cut behind the parsonage. Her voice shook, but her eyes were dry. Silence followed. Then another voice. Silas Eaton, died in the fields. They said it was wolves. There were no wolves. And then another. Eliza Trent, hung in the well. One by one the names spilled forth like floodwaters breaching a dam. Not confessions, not quite, remembrances. Of the ones erased, buried not just in earth but in language, forgotten through willful silence. Rebecca and Rachel said nothing, but they listened. Every time a name was spoken, their eyes seemed to sharpen, as if the syllables were cutting something loose, something tethered too long beneath the skin of this town. Phillips flipped through the book. Page after page, new names seared themselves into the parchment, forming under his fingertips like scars. And then, a crack from the chapel. The silhouette of the girl, Hope, stood in the doorway. The smoke around her now tinged red, as though the fire had followed her here from 1818 and had never fully gone out. She raised one hand and pointed at the steeple. Everyone turned. The bell tower. It hadn't rung in years. The bell was rusted, broken, but now it swayed. Slightly. Ding. Just once. Then silence. A warning. Rachel stepped forward, her voice cold. You're not finished. One name remains, one no one wants to say. Phillips felt it before he understood it, a sick feeling curling in his stomach. He looked at Ezekiel, but Ezekiel wasn't looking back. He was staring at Rebecca, and she whispered, "Tell them who built the chapel." The words fell like thunder. Tell them who built the chapel. The crowd shifted, eyes darted, whispers rose like smoke. Ezekiel stood frozen. The question lingered, not just in the air, but in the bones of the town. Pastor Phillips spoke slowly, as if dredging the answer from a swamp inside his own memory. It was built in 1791. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. Rachel whispered, "No, it was paid for in 1791. It was built in 1789. That small difference shattered something. Ezekiel exhaled, and it sounded almost like a confession. Rachel stepped forward and spoke again, clear, louder this time. "Say his name, Ezekiel." He shook his head. "No." "Then we will." And with that, the church doors swung wide, but not by wind, by force. Inside the chapel, the cracked wall behind the pulpit split fully in two, and from within it, as if the very structure had become a mouth, a voice boomed, ancient and deep, Abner Keene. Silence. A name no one had spoken aloud in generations, a name struck from records, from stone, from stories. But the land had not forgotten. The bell tolled again, louder, ding, ding, ding. And every time it rang, the chapel shook. Phillips's voice was barely audible over the noise. Abner Keene. He wasn't a pastor. He was something else. He came from Georgia, said he was a man of God. But the records... Rachel interrupted. He never brought God. He brought the book. She pointed to the altar, the leather-bound ledger. Phillips flipped back through the pages, and now, on the very first, a new name had burned itself into place. Abner Keene, founder, false shepherd, blood architect. It felt like a scream had been etched into ink. Rebecca turned to the crowd. He didn't build the chapel to pray, he built it to contain. The ground trembled. Roots rose from the churchyard, curling like fingers from graves. He sealed the first girl beneath it, called it a consecration, but it was a binding, a burial alive. And then Rachel said what no one wanted to hear. Hope was not the first, only the last. The wind died. Not slowed. Died. A stillness fell across Pine Hollow that felt inhuman, like the world had stopped breathing. Every tree stood motionless. Even the clouds above the chapel froze in place, suspended like oil on water. And beneath that silence, the earth beneath the chapel began to moan. Not a human moan. Deeper, wet, rooted. Ezekiel fell to his knees. "I didn't know," he whispered, hands trembling. "I didn't know it went that deep." But Rebecca's eyes didn't blink. "You knew enough to hide us. You knew enough to come here." The chapel doors slammed shut behind them, even though no one had moved. Phillips turned and ran forward, trying to force them open, but the wood held fast, fused like bone. And then, the pulpit cracked in two. From the floor beneath it, a strange light pulsed up through the seams, red, then white, then black. A heartbeat. The light wasn't fire. It was memory. Bleeding. Phillips stepped back as the ground under the altar rose, tilting slowly, revealing a trapdoor. One he didn't know existed, or rather, one he had forgotten. But Rachel remembered. She pointed at the door and said, "Abner Keene buried her here in 1789, alive, bound with scripture, nails through the hands, tongue cut out and mouth sewn shut with rosary wire." Phillips turned pale. The room grew colder. "Why?" someone whispered. Rebecca stepped forward. Her voice was softer than ever. "Because she heard the hum, like we did, and he thought if he buried her, it would stop." Rachel added, "He called her the first harmonic. He said the ground sang through her, that she could name the things buried in the earth before they were ever born." Someone in the crowd vomited. A child began to cry. And still the chapel would not let them leave. The twins turned to Pastor Phillips. "The book must go down there," Rebecca said. and one man must go with it. Ezekiel stepped forward, but Rachel shook her head. Not you, him. Philip stared at the pulsing trapdoor. Why me? Rebecca's eyes darkened. Because you wrote her name last. The trapdoor opened without a sound. No creak of hinges, no sigh of dust. Just a smooth, quiet invitation. Philip stared down into it, his breath catching in his throat. No steps, no ladder, just a black, yawning hole carved directly into the earth, its edges soft, like flesh. The pulsing light below throbbed once more, slow and deep, like a second heartbeat beneath the chapel floor. He turned to Ezekiel. But Ezekiel was crying now, not from fear, from relief, as if he had carried something inside him for too long, and now the earth was finally ready to take it back. Rebecca approached Phillips and held out the book. The leather was warm, almost alive. Reluctantly, his hand closed around it. It pulsed once in his grip. Rachel touched his shoulder, cold fingers, colder than the grave. You don't have to believe it, she whispered. You just have to deliver it. Behind them, the congregation watched, paralyzed. The old, the young, the guilty. They said nothing, because deep down, they knew. This wasn't just a ritual, it was a reckoning. Phillips knelt beside the hole. The smell hit him first. Not rot, not death. Something older, like wet stone sealed for centuries. He lowered himself in slowly. First his feet disappeared, then his legs, then his torso, and finally his head slipped below the floor of the chapel like a man being swallowed not by a place but by time itself. And still he descended, though there were no rungs, no rope, no bottom. The earth took him, gently, deliberately, carrying him downward like a mother carries a child. The deeper he went, the warmer the soil became. Sweat dripped down his spine, and in the dark he heard her. Not a voice, not words, a hum, low, vibrating through the bone, and then a room, carved into the clay, candleless, lightless. But he could see, and in the center of that room, she waited. She didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't blink. Yet Pastor Phillips knew without doubt that she was alive. Not in the way the living are alive, but in the way a curse lives. The girl sat cross-legged in the center of the chamber, her hair long and matted, coiled across her lap like wet rope. Her skin was the color of old wax. Her hands lay flat on the earth, palms up, nails cracked, fingers splayed as if she were still listening through the soil. And her mouth, sewn shut, stitched through with black rosary wire. Each knot was a prayer. Each prayer, a betrayal. Her eyes opened. Not fast, just enough to make him gasp. There was no white in them, only black, endless, reflective, swallowing black. And in their depth, he saw fire, not flames. Memories. He took one step forward. The book in his hands pulsed violently, 3 times, and the chamber responded. The walls breathed. The very clay exhaled dust and bone. She tilted her head. Philip spoke, though his voice was weak. I didn't know. I didn't want to know. The girl didn't respond. Couldn't. But her hands moved. Left palm turned inward. Right palm drew slow shapes in the dirt. Circles, spirals, letters, then numbers. Then, dates. 89, 1818, 1834, 2025. Phillips fell to his knees. The book dropped between them. Instantly its cover split open, pages turned, names burned themselves onto the parchment with impossible speed, one after another. Hope Whitman, Matthew Croft, Eliza Trent, Silas Eaton, Ruth Avery, and then his own, Elias Phillips, shepherd, scribe, coward. He reached out to touch the name, but the girl's hand snapped up and gripped his wrist. tight, too strong, too real. The hum rose, higher now, closer to a scream, and the wires on her mouth quivered. Not from breath, from pressure, from something inside her trying to get out. The wall behind her cracked open, a narrow shelf, a cradle of stone. She released his arm, then pointed to it. He understood. The book belonged there. She was its anchor, its origin, its wound. He placed it on the stone. The hum stopped, all at once. She closed her eyes and lay back. Not asleep, just waiting. And as he turned to leave, the soil swallowed the book whole. The chamber sealed itself behind him. No sound, no struggle, just the quiet thud of something ancient completing a ritual it had waited 2 centuries to finish. Pastor Phillips stood in the dark, trembling. The path upward was gone, but the earth was shifting, making room. A tunnel opened before him, not carved by tools, but grown. Its walls pulsed faintly, lined with roots and bone, like veins through which memory traveled. He stepped forward. Each footfall echoed not through air, but through time. And then he saw them. Figures in the walls. Dozens, hundreds, not alive, not dead. Witnesses, children with stitched mouths, women with open throats, men with hollow eyes. Some wore the clothes of 1780, some of 1830, some more modern, flannel shirts, old denim, a scout uniform, a wedding veil, all part of the soil now, fossilized in horror, holding their stories in silence. Each one turned toward him as he passed. Phillips couldn't look away. One figure, an old man with an eye patch, opened his palm as Phillips approached. Burned into it was a name, Abner Keene. Another child held out a torn ribbon. Hope. And still, no one spoke. Only that hum in the soil, deep, mournful, full of longing, as if the land itself wanted to scream but could only vibrate. Then he emerged. Through a hollow in the roots, Phillips stumbled out into the chapel's crypt. Dust poured off him, the trapdoor above slammed shut. He was back, alone, but not untouched. The congregation stood above, still frozen in shock. Rachel and Rebecca had waited, and when they saw his face, they knew. He was no longer just a man. He was a vessel. Something had passed through him, branded him. Rachel looked at the walls. The cracks were sealing. The smoke was gone. The chapel, breathing easier now. Rebecca turned to the crowd. Now you remember. But Ezekiel stepped forward and pitied. Had asked the one question no one dared. What happens when she wakes? Rachel looked at him slowly. She doesn't wake. We do. They left the chapel in silence. No one rang the bell. No one looked back. The air outside was thick, charged, like after a storm, but the skies were clear. No wind, no birdsong, just the oppressive stillness of a town trying not to remember what it already knew. Rebecca walked at the front of the group, hands steady, eyes fixed on the horizon. Rachel walked just behind her, barefoot now. The earth welcomed her steps, dust curling around her toes like recognition. Ezekiel stayed near the children. Pastor Phillips trailed behind them all, hands raw, fingertips stained with the clay of the underworld. He didn't speak, didn't blink much either. Something had shifted behind his eyes, like his soul was still somewhere below, humming in tune with the girl in the dark. They gathered in the town square. What was left of Pine Hollow stood in a wide, quiet circle. 23 families, all descended from the original settlers. All connected to her. Rebecca spoke first. The ledger is sealed, for now. A murmur. Ezekiel interrupted. What happens next? Rachel answered, voice cold. That depends on who tells the truth. The townspeople looked at one another. One man stepped forward, older, trembling. She was my grandmother's sister, Hope. We were told she went west. Another woman, mid-50s, choked out her confession. My great-aunt used to hum in her sleep. My father beat it out of her. One by one they came forward, not with excuses, But memories, suppressed, twisted, incomplete, now returning. Rebecca wrote their names on a new parchment, not in ink, but in ash. She said, "Those who remember must guard, those who confess must listen, and those who remain silent." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to, because the ground shuddered slightly beneath their feet, just enough to remind them. She was still down there, waiting, not out of malice, but out of need. Rachel's voice carried one final truth over the crowd. This town was never cursed. It was warned. And then, behind them, the chapel door creaked open again, but no one had touched it. And inside, on the altar, the book had returned, closed, bound, breathing. They didn't go back inside. Not yet. The chapel stood like a wound that refused to scab, still pulsing faintly, its old wood darkened from within. A place once meant for salvation now sat like a throat that had swallowed too much truth. Pastor Phillips stared at the open door. The book sat squarely on the altar, but it wasn't where he had left it. It never would be. Rachel approached the threshold slowly. She didn't cross it. She just whispered, "She hears us now, all of us." Behind her, the townspeople stood motionless. Each of them had bloodlines that twisted backward like old vines. Each of them had benefited from forgetting. Now they had remembered, and the question hung above them like a noose. What comes next? Ezekiel was the first to speak. "We seal it again, pour concrete, salt the ground, destroy the chapel." Rebecca shook her head slowly. "You can't seal a mouth that wasn't yours to open." Then Rachel added quietly, "She's not a curse. She's the ledger, the mirror, the weight." A boy in the crowd, no older than 12, raised a shaking hand. "Is she angry?" Rebecca knelt beside him. Her voice softened. "No, not angry, just awake." She placed a small brass key in the boy's hand. "One day, it will be your turn to carry it, but not yet." The key shimmered for a moment in the light. And then, the bell above the chapel rang once. No one had pulled the rope. It rang low, cold, final. A man in the back fell to his knees, whispering scripture, but the words no longer sounded like protection. They sounded like echoes from a time that had lied to them. Rachel turned to the town. "You can leave. Some of you will, but she'll still be beneath you, whether in Pine Hollow or 1,000 miles away." Phillips finally spoke. His voice was gravel now. "What does she want?" Rebecca answered without turning. "Not want, need. She is memory. She is the balance." Then she looked back at him, eyes full of something ancient. "And she knows your name." That night, no one slept, because something had shifted in the dirt, something permanent, and no one, not even the trees, would ever forget again. By morning, the chapel was gone, not destroyed, swallowed. Where once there had been a rotted wooden structure clinging to the side of the hill, now there was only soil, rich, black, undisturbed. No splinters, no foundation, no bell, just a faint circle of ash, like the scar left behind by a cauterized wound. Philip stood at its edge, hat in hand. He didn't speak. He didn't pray. He simply listened. And beneath the wind, beneath the rustling leaves and the hush of waking insects, there it was again, the hum. Not loud, not threatening, just present, constant, alive. Rachel came up beside him, her dress dusted in morning dew, her hair matted from the night before. She looked down at the soil and said, "She's not buried. She's planted." Phillips turned to her, eyes hollow. "What grows from that?" Rachel's voice never wavered. "Whatever we deserve." Back in the town, people began moving differently. Slower, careful, every nail hammered, every field ploughed, every lullaby sung now carried the weight of an unseen witness. In schoolhouses, children were taught names that had once been erased. In kitchens, grandmothers whispered old truths over boiling pots and warned, "Never hum in the dark." One woman, silent for 30 years, began singing again, but only in minor keys, and always at dusk. The crops that year were plentiful, but the livestock often stood at the edges of their fields, staring east, toward the scarred hill, ears twitching to a song no man could hear. One morning, a child claimed to have seen her. The girl beneath the earth. She stood at the edge of his bed, eyes black as pitch, humming something soft. When he blinked, she was gone. But where she'd stood, the floorboards were damp, and a single white ribbon lay curled like a question. The boy's mother burned the ribbon, but the next morning there was another. This one, too, tied into a perfect knot. They say the hum never really stops in Pine Hollow, only fades, until you lie down to sleep and remember something you were told to forget. The ledger was full, not with ink, but with names whispered into the soil. By year's end, the wind carried new sounds through Pine Hollow, half-syllables, fragments of lullabies that no one remembered teaching. Children began humming in unison without planning to. Doors opened before knocking, candles flickered without flame. And yet, there were no more deaths, no more disappearances, no more false prophets. Because the town had finally done what it never dared before. It listened. Pastor Phillips never preached again. He tended the graveyard now, not to bless it, to guard it. He spoke softly to the headstones, not with scripture, but memory. He remembered them by name, and every so often, when the ground felt warm and the air too still, he'd place a ribbon by the oldest grave. The name had worn off long ago, but he knew whose it was. Hope Morrison. She had returned not as vengeance, but as reckoning, and reckoning, once fed, becomes hunger again. Ezekiel left Pine Hollow. Some say he moved west, others say he vanished. But Rachel knew the truth. He had offered himself to balance what had been taken. His coat was found folded on the chapel hill one morning beside a cracked hymnal. The page torn out was blank, but smelled like ash. Rebecca remained. She taught the children, not just arithmetic and grammar, but legacy, ritual, boundaries. The kind of boundaries that keep more than wolves from the door. Every year, on the anniversary of the storm, they gather at the chapel's vanished foundation, not to mourn, not to worship, to remember. And one by one they place white ribbons at the center of the ash circle. Some flutter, some sink into the dirt. But all are received. One child, Elijah, once asked her if the girl beneath the earth still listened. Rebecca knelt beside him. "Not only does she listen," she said, "she chooses who spare." Acts next. That night, Elijah dreamed of roots, tight, wet, pulling him gently downward. And when he awoke, he was humming. Years passed. Pine Hollow aged but never withered. It remained suspended, neither alive nor dead, a place carved out of time, where the past had teeth and the soil still breathed. Tourists never came, GPS never quite mapped it. Roads bent away just before the town's edge, like the land itself refused to be rediscovered. But those who knew, those who carried the name, stayed. They kept their heads low and their memories sharp. In the town's small library, behind a false wall, sat a new book, not bound in leather, not cursed or blood-stained, just heavy. Each page bore a single name, a single date, and a single confession. Some names had been scratched out, others had bled through the paper, but none were forgotten, because memory, once rooted, grows. Rachel passed in her sleep at the age of 87. She left no children, but every child in Pine Hollow had once called her teacher. And on the night of her burial, a storm swept through that didn't touch the crops, didn't bend the trees, only howled through the empty chapel hill and died down with the sunrise. On her grave, someone left a single white ribbon, tied in a knot only hope would know. Rebecca grew old slowly. She taught her last lesson beneath the ash tree at the town's edge, her voice barely a whisper. Truth is a girl buried alive, and she never stops humming. The next morning, she was gone, her shoes still under the chair, her hands pressed in the dirt. And beneath them, faint but unmistakable, was the same hum Pastor Phillips had first heard in the chapel floorboards all those years ago. It never stopped. Not really. Some nights, if you stand at the edge of where the chapel once was, you'll hear it too, low, rhythmic, like a lullaby buried too deep to rot. They say if you hum back, she might come to you, not to hurt you, not to drag you under, but to ask, "What did you forget?" And if your answer is silence, she'll know. Because in Pine Hollow, forgetting is the only sin, and the soil never forgives.